Between the release of Rise of the Zilart and the completion of Chains of Promathia, Square Enix had dropped their plans of terminating Final Fantasy XI thanks to its becoming one of the most popular MMOs of its time. However, instead of resting on their laurels, the development team rose to the challenge and developed another expansion that would forever change the identity of Final Fantasy XI. They began work on an expansion that would wind up being on par with the masterpiece they had just wrapped up, and they gave us more content than they had in all of the previous expansions combined. Treasures of Aht Urhgan gave Final Fantasy XI another phenomenal journey, and this expansion can only be described as the heart of Final Fantasy XI. In the summer of 2005, Square Enix had a problem that most developers could only dream of. After the rise to success of its second expansion, the game was at a crossroads of sorts. Would they try to follow up the expansion that turned the game around, or would they let the game end where it was planned to end? In the Tokyo Game Show of 2005, Square gave their answer. They announced a new expansion, Treasures of Aht Urhgan, and would soon release the expansion trailer to follow this up. One thing they announced was that this expansion would not release most of the story up front like they did with Chains of Promathia, but rather release the story in smaller chunks evenly across the months following the release. This was to balance resources between the story and the brand new types of gameplay content in the works. On top of all of this, they announced several new jobs with this expansion as well. It was becoming clear. Treasures of Aht Urhgan wasn't going to be a story-focused expansion like its predecessor. It was going to be much more. Treasures of Aht Urhgan comes out, and within just a few months of its release, the amount of content Final Fantasy XI had was almost doubled. Many systems were added into the game that few people saw coming. Systems like Chocobo Raising, Assault, Besieged, Chocobo Racing, a monster arena, and still so much more. The scope of development had magnified beyond anything the game had seen up until this point. Just to give an example of just how much production increased for the game, in the 4 years before Aht Urhgan, there were 3 types of instance battle content: D-Dynamis, Dreamworld Dynamis, and Limbus. In the 19 months of Aht Urhgan's lifecycle, the game got Assault, Besieged, Salvage, and Einherjar. All of these pieces of content were also just as, if not more intricate as the original Dynamis. In addition to all of this battle content, the game got 3 new jobs, a wealth of new zones, and 2 new elaborate NM systems. Treasures of Aht Urhgan wasn't just another expansion. It was an entirely new world for players to explore. With all of this planned content for the new expansion, it was obvious that Square wasn't going for the benchmark. They were trying to surpass it. But seeking to top an expansion like Chains of Promathia wasn't going to be as simple as pumping the game full of content. The quality of the content would have to hold up under the scrutiny of a fanbase forged in the fires of the previous expansion. Treasures of Aht Urhgan had been overpromised. The only thing left to be seen was if they could deliver. There is no better example of how the developers contended with the legacy of their recently finished expansion than the shift in scope of the new story. The stakes of Treasures of Aht Urhgan was noticeably smaller than that of the previous expansion. The conflict was no longer a battle against a deity for the existence of all life, but they were still able to uphold the feeling of grandeur in the game by taking the player to a brand new land of Aht Urhgan. With the help of the Tenshodo, the adventurer finds himself there. Rather than finding a peaceful, welcoming empire, the adventurer finds an empire embroiled in a 2-front war. One conflict with the Beastmen tribes of the east, and another with the powerful nation in the far east, where Tenzin in Chains of Promathia was from. This war has drained the empire so thoroughly that they are hiring mercenaries to bolster their military strength. This war isn't a small war either. The scale of the empire of Aht Urhgan is that of all 4 Middleland nations combined, and the scale of the conflict is quickly rising to match that of the Empire. After learning this, the Sons of Sandoria hold a summit with all 4 nations of the Middlelands as to how they might stop another conflict on the scale of the Crystal War. The nations ultimately decide to have you, the adventurer, work as a mercenary in the Empire to collect as much information as possible. After leaving the summit, you return to the Empire with a renewed mission. You are now an invested employee of a mercenary agency you became acquainted with on your first trip to the Empire, which is the Salahim Sentinels, run by the now iconic Naja Salahim. You aren't some lowly mercenary who came to the Empire for some gilvo. You have seen more things in your short years than most people of Vana'diel will see in their entire lives by this point. You quickly rise through the ranks, which gets you and Naja's little agency a lot of recognition, not least of which are those in the Royal Palace. This is where you, the player, is introduced to the expansion's main character, Aphmau, the Palace Puppet Master. Aphmau is a young girl who carries a lot of secrets, some of which afford her an immense amount of power over the Empire, but ultimately cost her the freedom she so desperately wants. Those at the palace ask you to accomplish two different things. The first is to find and recover 4 relics. These relics have something to do with one of the primary religions of the Empire. The Empire already has one of them, and the conflict they are fighting with the Beastmen turns out to be over the control of these 5 relics. It isn't obvious why both parties want these relics so badly, but they wind up being integral to the plot. The second task from the palace is to investigate the rumors of ghost pirates emerging and attacking the Empire's military fleet. Neither of these plot elements were at all interesting to me at first, but the writing in this expansion is so good that these 2 tasks wind up becoming the most interesting part of the expansion. Many people know by this point that the classic Final Fantasy summons, Odin and Alexander, play a large role in this plot. The way these 2 summons are tied into these tasks offer a great deal of world building around the roles these avatars play in Eleven's world, and it does this while fleshing out a small cast of lovable characters. And just as a quick aside, the writing in this expansion is truly a step above what it was in Chains of Promathia. The previous expansion may have been the beginning of great stories being told in Final Fantasy MMOs, but Treasures of Aht Urhgan is the first great story told with a level of storytelling to match. This expansion avoids many issues that Chains of Promathia had with bloat, contrivances, and ambiguity in the way it tells its story. Everything in this story is polished and refined, where almost no scene or line of dialogue or plot point feels out of place. Aphmau, one of the main characters of the expansion, is a phenomenal example of how relatable characters should be written. The difference between the way she conducts herself when she's comfortable versus when she's on important business gives her a multidimensionality that is difficult not to appreciate. And seeing how someone like her develops as a consequence of being betrayed by those she most trusts is among the best examples of characterization in the game. Luzif, captain of the Black Coffin, a ship in the navy of the ancient kingdom of Aphramad, is forced to confront the fact that the purpose of his existence is built on the lies he is responsible for telling himself. Seeing the changes in this character by meeting Aphmau and the adventurer is another highlight in the story. While these 2 characters are the most central characters of the expansion, there was one important character that fell short of the mark. That character is Razfod, Aphmau's brother and Grand Vizier of the Empire. He is the only example that I could think of for an underdeveloped character. He came across as a little too one-dimensional, and while I've heard some say that his scenes of character development later on in the story do much to flesh out his character, there was no build-up or foreshadowing for these moments. Overall, I found his character to be the weakest in the cast, and given how he was supposed to be the foil of sorts for Luzif, the conflict between these 2 characters had a lot of wasted potential. That having been said, the only reason I single Razfod out is because every other relevant character is phenomenally written, such as Shantoto, whose personality is really fleshed out in this story for the first time, Naja Salahim, your boss at the new job, and Gesho, one of the co-workers of sorts that you have. These 2 last characters I mentioned are some of the reasons I think this expansion is so relatable. This is the first time in Final Fantasy XI that you actually have a job that you go into on a loose schedule. You have a boss that doesn't often pay you as much as she should, and you have co-workers who invite you out to tea houses to talk about their smaller gripes with your shared place of employment. Along with the great relatable main characters, it gives this otherwise idiosyncratic story an idyllic feeling that's hard to describe. the feeling of going to a new, unfamiliar world, going through mundanity with an unmatched level of competence compared to those around you, thanks to where you come from, and having important people quickly taking a liking to you. I just described most isekais. Well, there's no better time to go down this rabbit hole, I guess. The isekai subgenre of fantasy is best described by the translation of its name, Another World. In isekai stories, the main character is transported to a new, unfamiliar world where he is generally, but not always, more powerful than he was in his own world. The modern isekai trend has added certain themes such as being introduced to an important love interest, quickly finding a position of fame or infamy, and the main character needing to keep secrets about their own world, their past, or both. The modern isekai trend I just referred to started in the early 2010s, largely by the popularity of an anime that debuted, Sword Art Online. The subgenre was further popularized by subsequent anime and media that hopped on this trend. The market became oversaturated with isekai stories, but that hardly slowed further writing and production of them. Between the early and mid-2010s, there was such an overabundance of isekai stories that audiences both in Japan and the West began producing backlash. So for those of us who either weren't paying attention to this trend or were unaware of it at the time, the harsh and random disdain for these stories might seem excessive. But if you felt nauseated when you first heard me say that word, you remember this period well. Regardless, there are still plenty of great stories out there that borrow isekai themes. Neil Gaiman's Neverwhere is an isekai. Peter Pan is an isekai. Harry Potter is an isekai of sorts. By the way, Final Fantasy as a series is no stranger to isekai either. Final Fantasy X is an isekai, even though it pretends not to be with the whole time travel trick it tries to sell you. Final Fantasy XIV Shadowbringers has a lot of these isekai themes, and Final Fantasy XI Treasures of Aht Urhgan is not an isekai. The reason I bring this genre up is, while you aren't really taken to a new world, this expansion does a phenomenal job at utilizing the plot points and themes that would wind up popularizing the isekai genre several years later. You are taken to a new land to work a mundane job that you easily excel at. Your co-workers develop a deep respect for you. The overcompetence that became a staple of these stories shows up here insofar as you're in this empire on behalf of the 4 Middleland nations on an important assignment that you can't talk to others about. There are plenty of people who talk down to you and disrespect you. You, the slayer of the Shadow Lord, enemy of the Zilart Princes, vessel of the light of the Mother Crystals, and defender of Vana'diel from Promathia, you saved the world not once, not twice, but 2.5 times. I guess the stakes weren't as high in the nation missions, but that's still 2.5 times more than those talking down to you. You also quickly befriend some of the most lovable and respectable characters in the entire game. This feeling that you've found the place that you belong permeates every aspect of this expansion. The feeling of escapism isn't just limited to the story of Treasures of Aht Urhgan, though. It extends deep into the gameplay additions as well. It doesn't take long to discover just how much there is to do in the new area of Aht Urhgan. As mentioned before, there is a behemoth amount of content added. In addition to the new jobs and zones, there were 4 new pieces of battle content, 2 new NM systems, and a wealth of recreational content unlike anything before. Throughout the story, you're introduced to the new jobs, thanks to many of the main characters exhibiting these jobs. Aphmau is a puppet master, Luzif is a corsair, and Razvad has a connection with the Immortals, which are an elite subset of the Aht Urhgan military that creates and exclusively employs blue mages. The new job Corsair is one of the best jobs you can level, even if you don't intend on doing any content with it, largely because its set of abilities lends itself well to so many other aspects in the game. There is an ability for increasing your rate of XP gain, one for increasing movement speed, and one for increasing accuracy, and many more. Corsair is one of the best jobs to level for modern players looking to play through the story content. largely thanks to all of these different abilities. Puppet Master is another pet job that has an oddball set of stats that really plays like nothing else in the game. Gearing up for this job felt particularly exciting for me thanks to how elaborate the new automaton system is. Between the three jobs, Blue Mage definitely felt like it was given the most love. This job takes many systems developed for the mobs of the game and repurposes them in a way that really brings the game world to life. While collecting all of the blue magic spells can feel like a bit of a grind, I personally had a blast with the entire system. Blue Mage is my favorite job in Final Fantasy V, and even though it's had plenty of iterations throughout the franchise, I always felt like no game in the main FF series was able to convey the excitement of learning enemy skills quite like the Blue Mage's debut. That was until I played the Blue Mage in Final Fantasy XI. In this game, you also have to go out and find the correct monster type and learn skills from them, just like Final Fantasy V. But 11 also adds so much more to the job that I can't help but feel that this is the best iteration of Blue Mage in the entire series. There are so many unique mechanics to Blue Mage that learning how to play the job was the most fun I had with the leveling process in the entire game, even if collecting the spells, like I said, does feel like a bit of a grind. And I'm also glad that Blue Mage was done well in Final Fantasy XI, because Final Fantasy XIV would certainly falter on that front. The zone design of this expansion might not have the same spectacle of the Chains of Promathia zones, but they are just as, if not more, intricate as the Rise of the Zillard zones. Many of the new zones are split up across multiple maps, have plenty of branching paths, and are by far the prettiest 11 had looked up until this point. The development team expressed wanting to elevate the visuals of Final Fantasy XI, and certainly weren't joking. So many of the new textures and details throughout the expansion make Aht Urhgan really come to life. The zones are packed with new beautiful details that also go beyond just the visuals. I don't know why, but the new footstep sound effects added for the undersea ruins is unexplainably satisfying. With these new zones, they were able to tackle many similar zone types, such as jungles or ruins, but make them feel wholly unique. While I miss the spectacle and grandeur of the Chains of Promathia zones, Treasures of Aht Urhgan zones and all of their included activities are one of the biggest reasons outside of the story that Treasures of Aht Urhgan has that special charm that no other expansion in the game has. As far as battle content, this expansion added Assault, Besieged, Salvage, Einherjar, and 2 new NM systems, so brace yourself because I'm about to blitz through a summary and my impressions of each of them. Assault is a type of content that tasks players with going on a type of instanced missions. These assault missions are greatly varied in the types of things that the players are doing, and I've found this variety to be incredibly enjoyable. Upon participating in these assault missions, you are rewarded with assault points, which can be used to purchase an enormous amount of things from different NPCs all throughout the expansion. These missions also reward rank up points, and once you have enough of these acquired, you can start quests that elevate your rank in the Empire, which is necessary to build a mythic weapon, one of the ultimate weapon types, or Rimas in the game. One notable thing you can buy with assault points is a remnant permit, which gives you access to another type of battle content called Salvage. Salvage has the players exploring and battling through one of the 4 remnants in the undersea ruins, with a bit of an interesting twist. At the beginning of the battle content, you are stripped of many of your core abilities, such as using equipment or using your sub-job. As you progress through the areas, you are given drops from mobs that allow you to re-unlock all of the core abilities again. You can also trade these drops to spawn special NMs, which allow further progress through the content upon their defeat. Salvage rewards players with special gear, as well as a form of currency called alexandrite, which is needed for upgrading mythic weapons. This is the battle content I enjoyed the most by far, largely due to the way it limits you and rewards you for progress. Going from having no equipment and sub-job to having nearly everything you usually do feels even more frenetic than the systems of chests found in Limbus. The next type of special battle content added is Einherjar. This content has players fighting through one of 8 chambers separated into 4 tiers of difficulty, the hardest of which has you squaring off against Odin. Within these chambers, you are tasked with clearing out the monsters spawned in the room and defeating the chamber boss in exchange for a type of currency called Ichor. This currency is used to purchase items to unlock the next tier of difficulty. This is also necessary for purchasing an item related to creating mythic weapons. This means that if you're wanting a mythic weapon, you'll be doing a lot of Assault, Salvage, and Einherjar. This content also rewards Odin gear and Abjuration gear, and while I didn't spend much time here, I found it to be enjoyable, but not as enjoyable as many of the other types of content in this expansion. Besieged is a type of open-world content that well fleshes out one of the plot points in the story. The Empire of Aht Urhgan is at war with 3 of the beast tribes in the area. Those tribes are the savages of Mamulajah, the troll mercenaries, and the undead swarm. These 3 beastman tribes go through cycles of training, preparing, advancing, and attacking the city of Al-Zabi, with the goal of capturing the relic that the story centers on. Players are able to disrupt this cycle by raiding the beastman regions, defending the city when they attack, or regain the relic if they fail to defend the city. This content rewards players with experience points and Imperial standings, which is this expansion's equivalent to conquest points from the base game. I found this content to be really approachable and quite enjoyable thanks to the rewards offered by content this quick and easy. The Imperial standings you earn in Besieged can be used to participate in 2 very different NM systems in the game. The Imperial Standing NM system requires you spend Imperial standings for items that give you access to certain fights with special rewards. This is the ISNM system. And to participate in the Zen NM system, you need certain gear that can be bought in a roundabout way with the same Imperial standings. This NM system is by far the most intricate NM system in the game up until this point, due to the photography minigame requiring players to capture plates of monster souls that can then be traded for the currency which ultimately pops these NMs. This is also the first time a flagship NM system wasn't tied to a single zone. This foreshadowed some of the changes made to the NM systems in the future. The ZNM system is just as infamous as the CNM system because of the bad publicity Final Fantasy XI got from its ultimate NM, Pandemonium Warden, but that's most certainly a story for another time. Now, if you're in the majority and didn't catch one iota of that, here is an equally incomplete and helpful chart I made to show the basic gameplay loop for the battle content in this expansion. If it looks complicated, that is most certainly because it is. The reason I felt the need to include this section in detail is because it's important for you, dear viewer, to understand one thing, and that is just how much there is to do in Treasures of Aht Urhgan. This is just the combat content too. We aren't even done with the gameplay additions yet. It isn't uncommon to come across players who talk about this expansion changing the core identity of Final Fantasy XI, and that is because this expansion gives an entirely new world, separate from that of the previous 2 expansions and the base game, to have fun in. All of this content takes the feeling discussed earlier, and it permeates it through the entirety of the gameplay loop. And nothing proves this point better than the last few things I want to talk about. The music of Treasures of Aht Urhgan is, in my opinion, a return to form for this game's soundtrack. As I mentioned before, the Chains of Promathia soundtrack has some of the highest highs in the series, but the soundtrack as a whole fell short of the mark for me. This could not be further from the truth for the Treasures of Aht Urhgan soundtrack. The pieces throughout this OST once again masterfully combine the ambience and melodies tailored to each area to greatly elevate almost every aspect of this expansion. Many of the different scales and instrumentation for these pieces are used masterfully to highlight zones, characters, or moments they're paired with. The piece Jeweled Boughs might be the highlight of the soundtrack. This piece does so well at conveying that feeling of heart or being where you belong that this expansion centers on. Just as a personal anecdote, I first started this expansion right after finishing the epilogue quests of Chains of Promathia. Those quests have some of the most epic moments in the entire franchise of Final Fantasy, and after finishing them, I had no motivation at all to go on and start Treasures of Aht Urhgan. But when I first got to Weijiaom Woodlands and heard the beautiful music, it sparked my curiosity enough to propel me to continue the game. By the time I finished the expansion, anytime I hear Jeweled Boughs, it reminds me of those magical moments throughout the expansion, of having discovered a new and exciting place. The melody, instrumentation, and chord progression come together to create for me what is now one of the most memorable pieces of music in the game. This isn't the only great piece though. This soundtrack has my personal favorite rendition of the Chocobo theme, and it has some of the best battle music in the game. It is now difficult for me to listen to this music and not feel that special feeling of escapism this expansion so well conveys. Finally, we get to the last content category added in this expansion, the category that I like to call the recreational content of Final Fantasy XI. Pancreation is 11's version of Pokemon. It isn't nearly as intricate or complex, but for someone like me who grew up with the Gen 3 Pokemon games, it is an absolute blast. The photography minigame I was talking about earlier is also used in Pancreation. You go out, find a monster that you would like to train, and you photograph it. You can then summon the monster in Pancreation to fight, which rewards your monster with experience points. Your monster can level up, and you can teach your monster new abilities as well. Once your monster gets strong enough, it can participate in a special tournament arena for the chance to win or defend a title. And that's about it for Pancreation. It rewards you with a type of currency that may help you get started in the ZNM system, but that currency isn't valuable after obtaining that gear. It's only used for Pancreation-related things. The second type of content in this category is Chocobo Racing. There's one problem with Chocobo Racing though. That is that to race a Chocobo, you need to raise one first. And it takes an entire real-world month to raise a Chocobo. I may be wrong, but perhaps one of the reasons I've never heard of anyone talking about 11's Chocobo Racing is because of this massive barrier to entry. Truth be told, I don't know who in their right mind would dedicate an entire month to raise a mount that isn't even as fast as the login mounts. Alright, I just wanted to see what Chocobo Racing was like. Chocobo Racing in this game is probably the most boring it has ever been in the Final Fantasy series. First of all, you don't race your own Chocobo, you have a jockey do it for you. Secondly, your involvement in the race is limited to how you raise the Chocobo, the type of equipment you give it, and the few commands that you give it in the race. There are a couple other factors here, but for the most part, that's it, and I might have loved it. I fully realize that this minigame doesn't add anything of substance to Final Fantasy XI. However, I would be lying if I said I didn't find it to be a lot of fun. That is my Chocobo, the bird that I spent the last month of my life raising. It's wonderful to see it win, even if it loses most of the time. It's still my bird. Seriously though, this was a fun little minigame that broke up some of the monotony of the other pieces of content in this expansion, and getting lost in both Chocobo Racing and Pancreation may or may not be the reason this review took much longer to make than the previous review. There is one glaring issue with these content pieces though that I haven't touched on yet. I would have never tried Pancreation or found out about Chocobo Racing in 11 if it wasn't for my desire to go back and engage with the Treasures of Aht Urhgan content. These pieces of content aren't well integrated into the gameplay loop of the expansion like the other pieces of content, but I did find out about them, and I did enjoy them, specifically because Treasures of Aht Urhgan has that special feeling. I know I'm over-elaborating on this point, but I cannot stress just how much this feeling permeates this expansion. I remembered finishing Treasures of Aht Urhgan for the first time and moving on to Wings of the Goddess. For the first couple hours of that expansion, I found myself wanting to go back to Aht Urhgan Whitegate. I frequently looked through the content list for this expansion just for an excuse to go back and listen to the music and revisit some of the characters. I wound up burning up time in the Colosseum, failing a lot of assault missions, and defending Alzabi from the Beastmen armies, just to be back in Whitegate. Treasures of Aht Urhgan elicits that feeling of happening upon a place that you don't want to leave, being that place you always want to return to. Its characters feel more like real people than any other set of characters in the game up until this point, and its story is the first truly polished and refined narrative with top-notch storytelling. Much of the music now makes me feel melancholy just after a few seconds, and it's an expansion I had a hard time leaving. Treasures of Aht Urhgan matched its predecessor, Chains of Promathia, in terms of quality, not by outdoing it in certain aspects, but by offering a completely different experience. Treasures of Aht Urhgan may not have the most bombastic plot or the greatest spectacle, But I wouldn't change any of that because Treasures of Aht Urhgan is the heart of Final Fantasy XI. As complicated as the gameplay loop for this expansion is, I would have had a really tough time understanding it on my own. Thankfully, several people helped me through this learning process and talked to me about how Treasures of Aht Urhgan affected the player experience at the time of release. In addition to all of the people who've been helping me thus far, I'd also like to thank the Reddit users CMDR Woodgrain and The True Milo. Both of your inputs really helped me out in making this video. And also, thank you, dear viewer, for watching till the end.